I sat down one night last winter with a calculator and 20 years of crumpled receipts from every bait shop between Memphis and Knoxville. I added up every single container of nightcrawlers, every cup of red wigglers, every overpriced tub of grubs I ever handed cash over for. The total came out to just over $14,000, and I actually pushed back from the table when I saw that number staring at me. 14 grand on bait that was half dead before it even touched the water. Bait that sat in some refrigerated cooler, losing its scent profile by the hour. I have spent 2 decades setting up European rod pod systems on American rivers, chasing flatheads that most people think are legends, and holding 2 state records. And the entire time, the best bait I could ever use was breeding and multiplying right underneath the dirt in my own backyard. I walked past it every single morning on my way to the truck, drove 30 minutes to a tackle shop, and paid someone else for an inferior version. That realization did not just sting. It fundamentally rewired how I think about every dollar I spend on this sport. What I am going to break down for you right now is the exact underground bait farming system I built using materials that cost me absolutely nothing. This setup runs without electricity, requires no special equipment, produces both worms and grubs year-round, and it will permanently replace every trip you have ever made to a bait counter. The bait coming out of this system is not just free. It is genuinely better than anything you can buy because of how it is raised and what it feeds on. By the time you finish watching this, you will have every single detail you need to build your own version tonight if you want to. Your bait will be fresher, more active, and loaded with a natural scent chemistry that store-bought worms simply cannot match. I am not going to hold anything back or stretch this out with filler. Every sentence from here forward is a specific step or a specific lesson I learned the hard way. This is the system that replaced my tackle shop habit permanently, and I genuinely believe it will do the same for yours. So let me start with the first thing that will determine whether your system thrives or dies within its first 2 weeks. Location is the single most important decision you will make, and I know that because I got it completely wrong on my first attempt. I buried my first bucket right next to my driveway in a spot that caught full afternoon sun because it was convenient and close to where I load my gear. 10 days into a Tennessee July, I pulled that lid off and found what looked like a bucket of cooked pasta. Every worm was dead, and the smell was unbelievable. The sun had turned that buried container into a slow cooker, and I had basically braised 200 worms over the course of a week and a half. What I learned from that failure is that you need a spot on the north side of any structure, your house, your shed, a solid fence line, anything that blocks direct sunlight. The ground on the north side stays naturally cool and holds moisture even during the hottest weeks of summer, when everything else is baked dry and cracked. You want soil that clumps together when you squeeze it in your fist but does not actually drip water. That is the exact moisture range worms need to thrive. If you can find a spot near mature trees, even better, because the root zone constantly deposits organic matter into the surrounding soil, and that feeds your system passively. But the spot that ended up working perfectly for me was a narrow strip of ground that most people would completely ignore, and that is precisely what made it ideal. Now let me talk about the container, because this is where I see people make their first unnecessary purchase, and it drives me absolutely crazy. You do not need to buy a worm bin, a vermicomposting kit, or any of that overpriced plastic they sell online with fancy ventilation systems built in. Walk into any restaurant, bakery, or deli in your town and ask if they have empty 5-gallon buckets. They throw these away constantly and will hand them to you for free. These buckets are food-grade plastic. They are the perfect depth for a worm colony, and they are built to last outdoors for years without cracking or degrading. Grab a drill with a 3/16-inch bit and put 2 rows of holes around the bottom third of the bucket for drainage so water never pools at the base. Then drill another row of holes near the top rim for gas exchange. Worms need oxygen flow, or the bedding goes anaerobic and everything inside suffocates within days. Here is the key detail that makes the whole drainage system work. You need 2 buckets, one nested inside the other with a 2-inch layer of gravel between them. That gravel gap creates a reservoir where excess moisture drains away from the bedding but stays available as humidity. And that one detail is the difference between a thriving colony and a soggy graveyard. The container is just a shell, though. What you layer inside it is where the actual biology of this system either comes alive or falls apart completely. I learned this the hard way on my second attempt when I packed the bedding tight with nothing but damp, shredded newspaper and some food scraps mixed straight in. 3 weeks later, I opened that bucket and the smell hit me from 4 feet away. Black anaerobic sludge with 0 living worms and a layer of mold. The problem was simple. No carbon structure, no air pockets, no layering sequence, which meant no oxygen could penetrate below the top inch of material. Here is the layering order that actually works and has worked for me consistently across 3 years and 7 buckets without a single failure. Start with 2 inches of crushed dry leaves at the bottom. These create air channels and provide slow-release carbon that keeps the environment from going acidic. On top of that, add 3 inches of torn cardboard strips mixed loosely with used coffee grounds, which gives you a perfect carbon-to-nitrogen ratio right in the middle zone. Finish with 2 inches of aged grass clippings topped with a thin handful of native soil from your yard, and mist the whole stack until it feels like a wrung-out newspaper. Damp, but absolutely not wet. All right, the bed is built and the container is buried. Now you need worms, and I want to be very clear that you do not need to spend a single dollar ordering them online. The best starter colony you will ever find is already living in your own lawn, and collecting them requires nothing more than a headlamp and about 45 minutes of your time after a warm rain. I went out one night in early April after a solid evening downpour. Soil temperature was right around 55 degrees, and within 45 minutes, I had picked over 200 worms off the surface of my grass. The key is waiting until after dark on a night when the soil temperature is above 50 degrees, and rain has pushed the worms to the surface for air and moisture. You want to specifically look for red wigglers. They are smaller than common earthworms, darker red, and they have a more pronounced raised band around their midsection called the clitellum. Red wigglers reproduce roughly 3 times faster than regular earthworms. They tolerate the confined environment of a bucket dramatically better, and they are flat-out superior bait for catfish and carp. 200 worms is enough to fully stock 3 buckets because they will double their population within about 6 weeks if the bedding and moisture conditions are right. Now here is a twist that most people building these systems completely miss. The worms are actually only half of what this setup can produce for you. By adding one simple thing to the top layer of your bucket, you turn a worm farm into a dual-species bait factory that gives you 2 completely different bait types from one buried container. Take a small piece of overripe banana, a chunk of melon rind, or any soft vegetable scrap and lay it right on the surface of the top bedding layer without burying it. Black soldier fly females will find that scrap within days and lay clusters of tiny eggs right on it or on the bucket rim just above it. Those eggs hatch into grubs, fat, protein-dense, tough-skinned larvae that grow in the upper 2 inches of bedding while your worms work the deeper layers below. The 2 species do not compete with each other at all. They actually complement each other because the grubs break down fresh scraps rapidly into a form that worms can then process more efficiently. These grubs are absolutely devastating bait for channel catfish and carp because they are packed with fatty acids that disperse a strong scent trail in current. I started using them on a hair rig setup borrowed from European carp technique, and the results were immediate and consistent across multiple sessions and river conditions. And this is where the whole system starts to feel almost unreasonably good, because everything this dual colony needs to eat is already sitting in your kitchen trash can. Every single week you throw away the exact materials that keep this system running indefinitely without any purchased inputs whatsoever. Coffee grounds, banana peels, crushed eggshells, melon rinds, old lettuce, tea bags, apple cores, all of it goes directly into the bucket, about 1 cup per week per bucket. The eggshells are especially important because they provide calcium grit that the worms need for digestion, and they buffer the pH of the bedding to keep it from going acidic over time. What you never put in is meat, dairy, citrus, or onions. Meat and dairy attract rodents and create rotting anaerobic pockets. Citrus drops the pH so fast it burns the worms, and onions release compounds that are directly toxic to both worms and grub larvae. I am genuinely curious right now. How many of you watching this are already throwing away exactly this stuff every single week without even thinking about it? Drop a comment below and tell me what your kitchen scrap situation actually looks like, because I bet most of you are tossing out enough to run at least 2 buckets. The feeding schedule is dead simple. Once a week, pull back the top layer slightly, drop in your scraps, cover them back up with bedding, and walk away. But there is one critical mistake hiding in this process that will destroy everything you have built within the first month if nobody warns you about it. Overwatering kills more backyard worm systems than every other problem combined, and the margin between perfect moisture and fatal wetness is way smaller than people expect. Grab a handful of bedding and squeeze it hard. You should see 1 drop, maybe 2 drops of moisture come out, and absolutely no more than that. If water runs through your fingers, the bedding is too wet, oxygen cannot circulate, and your colony will suffocate in anaerobic sludge within a week or 2 at most. I lost an entire thriving colony one October because rainwater was running off my shed roof and pooling right into the gap between the lid and the bucket rim during heavy storms. The fix was embarrassingly simple. I draped a piece of old plastic sheeting over the lid with a slight dome shape so rain slides off to the sides instead of pooling on top. You can use a scrap of garbage bag, an old shower curtain, a piece of tarp, anything waterproof that you can shape into a slight peak over the lid opening. Every single time you add scraps, do the squeeze test on the bedding before you close the lid back up. It takes 3 seconds, and it is the single most reliable habit that separates systems that last years from systems that die in weeks. Now that you know how to build this thing and keep it alive through every season, the real question is the one that actually matters. Does this homegrown bait genuinely outperform what you can buy at a tackle shop? And the answer I discovered on the river changed my entire approach to chasing big catfish. I set up a proper controlled test on the Cumberland last September because I was tired of guessing and wanted hard numbers on the board. 2 rods mounted on the same pod, identical inline flat sinker rigs, same hook size, same leader length, cast to the same current seam about 40 yards out. Left rod got a store-bought Canadian nightcrawler straight from the Walmart cooler. Right rod got a red wiggler pulled from bucket number 3 that morning. I sat in my chair for 12 hours through the night targeting channel cats and kept a tally on my phone every time a bite alarm screamed. The homegrown worm rod put 7 fish on the bank before sunrise, while the store-bought rod managed exactly 2, and one of those was barely a pound. What got my attention was not just the final count, but the pattern I watched develop hour after hour across that entire session overnight. The homegrown rod was getting picked up within 15 or 20 minutes of every single rebait like clockwork without any dead stretches at all. The store-bought rod would sit for over an hour between runs, and by hour 6, I honestly stopped rebaiting it because the gap was already embarrassing. I repeated that same test 4 more times across summer, early fall, late fall, and early spring, and the ratios stayed remarkably consistent every single time. And the reason behind it is not what you would assume, because it has nothing to do with freshness and nothing to do with size. Every catfish angler knows these fish hunt primarily with their nose. Those barbels are basically chemical sensors dragging through the water column, reading molecular signatures like a bloodhound reads air. What most people do not think about is that a worm is not just a piece of meat on a hook. It is a chemical broadcasting station leaking amino acids and fatty acids into the current from the moment it hits the water. A nightcrawler raised in sterile commercial peat moss in some industrial facility in Ontario has been eating nutritionally blank substrate for weeks before it reaches your hook. Its scent output is like a radio station broadcasting at half power with most of the interesting frequencies stripped out of the signal entirely. A red wiggler raised in coffee grounds, banana peels, decomposing vegetables, and native soil crawling with microbial life develops a completely different chemical fingerprint that is denser and more complex. That complexity matters underwater because catfish and carp can detect a richer amino acid trail from significantly farther away in moving current than a simple one. European specimen carp hunters figured this out decades ago. Bait substrate chemistry is treated as serious science across the Atlantic, not an afterthought you ignore. The grubs amplify this even further because black soldier fly larvae are loaded with lauric acid and other fatty compounds that disperse aggressively in water and create an intense scent cloud right around your hook point. So the question becomes practical immediately. How do you pull bait out of a working colony without wrecking the population that took you weeks to establish in the first place? The answer is a technique I call light sorting, and it takes about 5 minutes with zero special equipment needed beyond a flat surface and some sunshine. Scoop out roughly the top third of your bedding and dump it onto a piece of plywood, a trash can lid, a flattened cardboard box, your truck tailgate, anything flat. Worms hate light with a passion that borders on phobia, and within 3 to 5 minutes, every single worm in that pile will have burrowed down to the very bottom. Scrape the now empty top bedding off the pile, toss it back in the bucket, and collect your concentrated worm cluster from underneath without ever disturbing the deeper 2/3 of the colony. For grubs, you do not even need that process. Just reach in and pick them right off the top inch of bedding near the food scraps where they always congregate. The critical rule is never harvest more than 1/3 of the visible worm population at any single time, no matter how big your session is going to be. The remaining breeding population will regenerate back to full capacity within 2 to 3 weeks, which means your supply chain never breaks and never even slows down significantly. Now here is the part that used to cost me more bait than anything else in 20 years of chasing flatheads on overnight sessions along the Cumberland. I would buy 2 or 3 containers of nightcrawlers from the shop, toss those styrofoam cups in my cooler, and by hour 20 of a summer session, half of them were pale, limp noodles that no self-respecting catfish would even investigate. The fix with homegrown bait is almost stupidly obvious once you think about it. You transport them in a handful of their own bedding inside any small plastic container with a few pinholes poked in the lid. That bedding is their home environment. The moisture level is already dialed in. The microbial community they are used to is right there surrounding them, so there is zero transition shock and zero stress die-off. On the bank, I take that little container and bury it 2 or 3 inches into the cool mud right at the waterline next to my rod pod setup. The riverbank becomes a natural refrigerator that holds temperature steady even when the air above is 90+ degrees and the humidity is choking thick. If I am running a marathon session past 12 hours, I will miss the bedding once with a splash of river water, and that is the entire maintenance protocol. Grubs are even less demanding. They will sit in a cup with a damp paper towel for 48 hours without losing a single larva, which makes them the most bulletproof bait you can carry. All right, summer performance is settled, but I know exactly what some of you are thinking right now. What happens in January when the ground freezes and everything above the surface is dead and dormant? Here is why the underground burial depth matters so much more than people realize when they first hear about this system and dismiss it as a warm weather trick. Soil at 18 to 24 inches deep rarely drops below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the air temperature is in the teens across most of the continental United States. Red wigglers slow their metabolism below 50 degrees, but they do not actually die until you approach genuine freezing and your buried bucket stays well above that danger zone. The winter adjustment is about as simple as it gets. Pile 6 to 8 inches of dry leaves or straw mulch over the buried lid as an insulation blanket in late autumn. That leaf layer traps ground heat exactly like a sleeping bag, and your colony ticks along slowly underground, while everything on the surface looks completely dead and frozen. In summer, the adjustment flips. Make sure your rain shedding cover is working properly and bump up your scrap feeding slightly because the colony processes food faster in warm conditions. If you somehow get an extreme heat event pushing soil temperature above 85 degrees at depth, which is genuinely rare in a shaded north side location, one frozen water bottle laid on the bedding surface once a week solves it completely. One bucket got me started, but what I am running now is something that would have sounded insane to me 3 years ago when I was still handing cash to bait shop owners every weekend. Once your first colony is established and you can see tiny baby worms threading through the bedding, usually around 6 to 8 weeks in sea, you can split that bucket and seed a completely new one at zero cost. Take half the bedding and half the worm population, drop it into a fresh prepared bucket with new layering, top both buckets off with additional bedding material, and within 3 to 4 weeks, both colonies are back to full production capacity. I currently have 7 buckets buried along the north fence line of my property, staggered so that I split one every couple of weeks and always have fully mature colonies available for harvest. 7 buckets produces more bait than I can use in 2 to 3 full fishing sessions per week, which for a guy running multi-rod pod setups and going through serious quantities of bait per night is genuinely saying something. I have not purchased a single container of bait from any shop in over 3 years, and my catch rates have gone up, not down, since making the switch permanently. 2 of my fishing buddies who thought I was losing my mind when I first told them about this are now running their own bucket lines after they saw what was happening on my rods session after session. But I want to be completely straight with you about a problem that almost made me abandon this entire project. Because if nobody tells you about it, you will find out the hard way just like I did. I walked out one morning to check my best producing bucket and found the lid pried completely off, claw marks scratched into the rim, and roughly half the colony just gone, eaten overnight by a raccoon that had apparently been casing my fence line for days. Moles, raccoons, armadillos, and possums will absolutely find your buried bait system because the worm activity and decomposition create scent signatures in the soil that these animals are built to detect from a distance. I lost 2 full colonies to wildlife before I figured out a fix that was so simple it actually made me angry at myself for not thinking of it immediately from the very beginning. A flat, heavy stone, a flagstone, a concrete paver, any flat rock over 15 pounds, placed directly on top of the bucket lid solves the raccoon and armadillo problem permanently and completely. They cannot grip it, they cannot flip it, and they eventually stop trying because the reward is not worth the effort of fighting a 15-pound slab every single night. For areas with especially persistent predators, you can add a loop of salvaged wire or an old bungee cord around the lid for extra pry resistance, but I have not needed that step personally. If any of you have tried worm farming before and had critters tear your setup apart, I genuinely want to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell me what got into yours and what you did about it. 3 years running with the stone method, and I have not lost a single worm to wildlife since that first raccoon raid, which means the system is now genuinely maintenance-free beyond tossing in scraps and occasionally harvesting. This is not really about the money anymore, even though $14,000 is a number that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it too long. It is about the fact that I can decide to fish at 11 o'clock on a random Tuesday night, walk to my fence line in the dark, pull a handful of fat, lively worms out of a bucket, and be on the water within 30 minutes with bait that outperforms anything sitting in any cooler in any shop in this state. No planning ahead, no detours, no showing up to find the bait fridge empty or the shop closed early because somebody had a dentist appointment. Just unlimited supply available every hour of every day, all year long. For someone who runs 3 and 4 rod setups simultaneously and burns through bait at a rate that used to require multiple containers per session, that kind of access is transformational in a way that is hard to overstate. The quality compounds over time too, because each generation of worms born in that rich organic substrate gets healthier, fatter, and more chemically potent than the last one. My year 3 worms are visibly different from my year 1 worms. Thicker, more active, darker in color, and they stay alive on the hook longer in current. My name is Marcus Vance. I have been chasing river monsters for 20 years. I hold 2 state records for flathead catfish, and I am telling you right now that this underground bucket system changed my fishing more than any rod or reel or rig I have ever owned. And I want to leave you with one image that sits in my head every single time I walk past that fence line on my way to the truck. The biggest fish I have ever landed, my 2nd state record flathead, 63 pounds of pure river mussel, came on a homegrown red wiggler pulled from bucket number 4 that afternoon. Not a fancy prepared bait, not some secret dip formula I spent years perfecting, not a $20 container of imported nightcrawlers shipped overnight in a climate-controlled box. A worm I raised myself in a 5-gallon restaurant bucket buried next to my fence, fed with banana peels and coffee grounds that would have gone into the garbage. That fish is mounted on my wall now, and every time I look at it, I think about the years and the thousands of dollars I wasted before I figured out what was right under my feet the entire time. Next video, I am going to show you the bait chemistry trick I use to supercharge these homegrown worms right before a big session. A method I borrowed directly from European carp anglers that makes catfish absolutely lose their minds when it hits the water. That one is going to change how you think about bait preparation completely, and you are genuinely not going to want to miss it. If this video gave you something useful today, hit subscribe and drop a like. It helps this channel reach more anglers who are sick of wasting money on bait that does not perform. I will see you on the bank.